Good evening, the Acting Vice-Chancellor, Professor Morala, members of the Executive. I've recognized Professor Kinterberger. I don't know if there's anybody else, but the respondent, Professor Pillay, Professor van Vuuren, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen. Professor van Vuuren's journey has been as follows. She grew up in Boksburg. Apparently she does not tell everybody this, I'm not sure why. And after navigating the intricacies of a Wits law degree for a year or two, she followed her heart and started a BSc degree at the University of Pretoria. She completed her MSc and PhD at the University of Pretoria under the supervision of Professor Terry Robinson, one of the leading mammalogists and cytogeneticists in South Africa. At the time of completing her PhD degree, which was in early 2000, Terry Robinson relocated to Stellenbosch University and Bettine joined the Great Trek South. In 2001, she spent a year in France as a postdoctoral fellow, where she worked with Professor Francois Katzeflies on the conservation and management of game species in French Guiana. In 2002, she returned to the wine district and took up a permanent position at Stellenbosch University as the laboratory manager. She then continued with her research into understanding genetic patterns in relation to the landscape and specifically how these patterns can inform the management of species. In 2011, she accepted a position at the University of Johannesburg, where together with Prof Peter Teske, she established a molecular zoology laboratory. Bettine's work has always had a strong conservation focus. She has been involved in groundbreaking research documenting genetic patterns for several of Southern Africa's economically important game species. Her expertise in the field is widely recognized, and she is often consulted by various government departments and conservation agencies, as well as the South African game farming industry. She is currently the scientific advisor to the Department of Environmental Affairs, Directorate's Biodiversity, Economy and Sustainable Use, as well as Biosecurity Services. As a core team member of the Center for Invasion Biology, she was responsible for coordinating aspects of the recently published regulations that accompany the National Environment Management Biodiversity Act, specifically coordinating the listing of vertebrates excluding fish. Bettine has a second research life further south. She has been involved with the South African National Antarctic Program for more than 10 years now, with 50% of her research focusing on understanding genetic patterns in the Antarctic and Southern Ocean islets. She was the first woman ever to be appointed as Chief Shore-Based Scientist during the Marion Island Relief Voyage, is currently the Vice Chair of the South African ICSU Committee for the International Research Committee on Antarctic Research, abbreviated SCAR, and is also the African representative on the SCAR Action Group. Bettine is on the Scientific Organizing Committee for the SCAR Open Science Conference to be held in Malaysia in 2016, a conference typically attended by several thousand international researchers. Making sure that science stays relevant to society is important to Bettine. To this end, she is the current president of the Zoological Society of Southern Africa, the vice chair of the NRF Foundational Biodiversity Information Steering Committee, the member representing zoological science on the ad hoc SANBI permitting panel, and she also serves on an NRF panel. Since 2007, she has published more than 60 full-length research papers, mostly in first-tier journals, and her work has been cited more than 1,000 times in the primary literature. High-impact work is always the result of large collaborations, and she currently collaborates with researchers in South Africa, the DR Congo, Australia, Europe, and America. She ascribes much of her success to collaborations and a dedicated lab constituent. To date, she has supervised and co-supervised more than 30 master's and doctoral students and hosted several postdocs. Professor van Vuuren, please.
Thank you very much, and Thank you very much to each and everyone who took the time to come and attend this tonight. I really appreciate that very much. Work can never be done alone and should never be done alone, and I really need to acknowledge a large number of friends, collaborators, students, both present and past. I wish to thank my support staff at the lab, both here and at Stellenbosch University, as well as a large number of agencies that thought good to support my work. I'm especially indebted to Terry Robinson and to Stephen Chown for all the support and for all the mentorship that they've provided over the years. I think no conversation about conservation biology can really take place without having a good understanding about what it is we wish to conserve. A recent paper, and this is a little bit disturbing because a recent paper that's appeared, I think a few weeks ago, essentially said that species richness estimates, in other words the number of species that we have not actually converged yet. So if you then if you essentially then look at this graph that I've lifted from the paper, what you see is, if we look for example at coral, which are the red dots, somewhere in 1989 they thought that there's somewhere between 500 and essentially 10 million species. And if we look again in 2010, then we see that that has not actually changed. We've not been able to narrow how many species we have. Even in terms of global biodiversity, they reckon there's anywhere between 1 million and 50 million species. We simply don't know what we have. And conservation against this backdrop is very, very difficult because you've got no idea what you are conserving, and you also don't know whether you are actually managing, whether you are successful to conserve it or not. A little bit about genetic information and how important this is in conservation biology. We've always accepted that species, or that variation within species, are geographically structured. In the past, phenotypic differences were always translated into subspecies or species. These often follow geopolitical borders. Animals, of course, or plants don't have passports, so this is not correct. It often followed geological features, which is often correct, and other landscape features. But the take-home message really is that conservation based on these sort of inaccurate ideas of what we have and where it is at best inefficient, and it might actually be to the detriment and the evolutionary potential of that species. Genetic diversity really is the evolutionary potential. It's your ability to be able to adapt to a changing environment. So if you've got very low genetic diversity, that is a problem. You've got no way to adapt to a changing environment. Populations are essentially at risk from environmental stochasticity, and this is just differences in the variation in the birth and the death rates from one season to the next. It can affect even very large populations. But demographic stochasticity, on the other hand, affects small populations, and that's why small populations are often a lot more at risk. Let me illustrate that with this graph. So genetic drift is really just random fluctuations in your alleles, or the frequency of alleles from one generation to the next. If you are a very large population, let's say the orange line, you can see that from year to year, there's very little variation or fluctuations in your allele frequencies, whereas if you are a small population, very quickly you will lose, just by randomness, you will lose specific alleles in your population. So you actually lose genetic diversity just through randomness because you're such a small population. What I will do in the talk is I'm going to sorry about that. What I'm going to do in this talk is essentially talk about two African examples of game species where we've been involved in research, sable and roan antelope. And then I'll change my hat a little bit and talk a little bit about my work in the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean region. Recently, this SANBI, or the South African National Biodiversity Institute, put out a document which they called LIFE. And it's essentially trying to understand what we have and where it is and why we have such a high diversity of species. And if you look at the map of South Africa at the bottom, which essentially represents the different biomes in the different regions, you can see that a lot of our diversity essentially comes from the fact that we've got a very diverse landscape, be that, or seascape as well, sea and land. Biodiversity in South Africa is then essentially regulated from two perspectives. First of all, from a threatened or protected species perspective, or just shortened for TOPS, as well as an invasive perspective. So there are these two very different viewpoints that essentially govern conservation and govern the management of biodiversity in South Africa. And this is actually quite interesting because you can be, as a species, endangered or threatened in a specific part of South Africa, but in another part of South Africa you can actually be an invasive species. So it is sort of a little bit of a tricky situation in terms of management. South Africa is also somewhat unique in that we have private ownership of biodiversity. There are not many countries in the world where biodiversity actually belongs to specific individuals. So the custodianship of this biodiversity essentially rests with government, for example, our national parks, with provinces, the provincial parks, but also with private individuals that own biodiversity. A conundrum here is that provincial authorities do not have sufficient funds to ensure the long-term conservation of our species. Private owners have those funds available, but the value of privately owned biodiversity is often driven by the rarity of a species. I have something that you don't have and you want it, and therefore you'll pay for it. Also uniqueness, and this is where the recent debate or debacle about colour variance actually comes in, but I'll say a little bit about that later on. What is quite interesting is that SANBI in their document actually recognizes this unique partnership between government, province and private individuals, where they specifically say that state meets the private sector in biodiversity stewardship programs, where private landowners enter an agreement with state conservation bodies actually enhances our conservation of species. Conservation strategies, at least from a private ownership perspective, then often include a large ecotourism component where parks or game farms stock attractive species. Nobody wants to go to a private game farm to see a klipspringer. Everybody wants to go to see a lion, a leopard and an elephant. So quite often this results in translocations of these so-called attractive species outside of their natural ranges. And these translocations often take place in the absence of detailed and accurate genetic information. Of course, we also have to say a few words about climate change, the spanner in the works. At the top left, what you see there is essentially what we have today. I'm just talking terrestrial biomes now, so you can see there's a savanna in the light green, grasslands in the darker green. Those are essentially the different biomes or the different vegetation types that are in South Africa today. And what they do quite often going into the future is they model different scenarios. If the temperature increases by so much, if it increases by so much. The worst case scenario is in D at the bottom, where if you compare what we have today to what we'll have under the worst climate change scenario going into the future, you'll see that we'll lose a lot of our grasslands. The desert will come in quite a bit into the northern Cape area. We'll essentially lose our Indian coastal belt, our forests along the coast. We will almost lose the Albany thickets, which is actually a very diverse area as well. So there, essentially South Africa will become a much more arid country. Of course, invasive species are also a spanner in the works in terms of this. And remember that what we have in South Africa are invasive species or species, alien species to South Africa from outside of our borders. But we also have this unique situation, as I said earlier, where individuals might, indigenous species might actually be invasive in an area in South Africa. So even if we see them as indigenous, South African indigenous species, outside of their natural range, they are actually invasive.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.